Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to put on our ancient history professor hats and examine a truly foundational text from the ancient Near East, the Book of Genesis. Now, you might be wondering, why should we care about a scroll written millennia ago? Well, because this isn't just some dusty old book. It's actually a revolutionary document that serves as the absolute gateway to all biblical theology, literally. Nearly every major doctrine in Scripture, from the creation of humanity to sin, the concept of covenant, and the ultimate messianic promise, they all start right here. Even the word Genesis literally translates to origin, source, or beginning. So we're going to dive deep and explore the narrative architecture of this text in copious detail. Okay, let's quickly run through our syllabus for today. We'll start with origins versus pagan myths, then look at the anatomy of human rebellion, move on to Abraham and divine covenant, trace Jacob and the 12 tribes, unpack Joseph and divine providence, and finally wrap up with theological themes and Christ. So Section 1, Origins versus Pagan Myths. This covers Genesis chapters 1 and 2. We kick off our textual archaeology with primeval history. But to really grasp just how radical Genesis was for its time, we have to first ask, how did ancient people actually view the cosmos? If we look at the surrounding cultural narratives from that era, think of famous texts like the Babylonian Enuma Elish or the Epic of Gilgamesh. Origins were always viewed through this lens of incredibly violent, unpredictable forces and warring deities. But when we compare those texts with Genesis, we find a brilliant ancient polemic. While neighboring empires believed creation was just born out of chaos and actually worshipped multiple battling gods, the Genesis account flips the script entirely. It presents creation as being born of divine intentionality by one single sovereign God who brings perfect order. It deliberately demotes the sun, moon, and stars, things those other cultures worshipped as literal gods, to mere created objects. Basically, they're just cosmic clocks serving God's purposes for days and seasons. Look at this opening declaration. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. This is an absolute thunderclap in ancient literature. It introduces creation ex nihilo. That's a Latin theological term meaning out of nothing. This establishes God's absolute sovereignty and eternity right from the jump. He's not just rearranging pre-existing chaotic matter like the gods of the surrounding myths. He literally speaks the very universe into existence. And there's this brilliant architectural symmetry to the 6 days of creation. The literary structure is highly intentional. First, God creates habitats on days 1 through 3. He separates the light, establishes the firmament of the sky, and draws out the dry land and vegetation. Then on days 4 through 6, he goes back and populates those exact habitats with inhabitants, the sun and stars, birds and sea creatures, and finally land animals. This whole sequence culminates on day 6 with humanity. We are made specifically in God's rational, moral, and spiritual image, and tasked with the stewardship of a perfectly harmonious, good creation. Zooming in on chapter 2, the text shifts from this massive cosmic scale down to intimate formation. The Hebrew imagery here portrays God as a careful potter, physically shaping humanity from the dust of the ground and breathing the breath of life right into Adam. He places them in the Garden of Eden, an incredibly abundant, sacred dwelling, nourished by 4 distinct geographical rivers, the Pishon, Gihon, Tigris, and Euphrates. And it's here, amidst perfect innocence, that God establishes the first covenant command regarding the 2 trees in the garden. This actually functions a lot like an ancient suzerain vassal treaty, warning them that eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil will bring death. Which brings us to Section 2, the anatomy of human rebellion, covering chapters 3 through 11. Genesis 3 explains the deeply tragic fall of humanity. The crafty serpent attacks God's word and his goodness. Eve gets tempted by the idea of moral autonomy. Adam passively just joins the rebellion, and the immediate devastating consequences are shame, fear, and exile from Eden. But amidst all this tragedy, we find a crucial theological term to define for our class today, the proto-evangelium. This represents the very first promise of redemption. God declares that the offspring of the woman will ultimately crush the head of the deceptive serpent. It's this tiny yet immensely powerful glimmer of hope in a really dark moment. From that point on, the historical narrative just traces a terrifying downward spiral. Sin crouches like a predator at Cain's door before he outright murders his brother Abel. Then we watch human corruption become so totally all-consuming that it necessitates a cosmic uncreation, the flood. The waters of chaos return, though God graciously preserves Noah in the ark. But here's the kicker. Even after the waters recede and the dove brings back the olive leaf, Noah's post-flood drunkenness proves a devastating point. External cleansing of the earth absolutely cannot change the internal corruption of the human heart. And this ultimately culminates in a unified human rebellion at the Tower of Babel in chapter 11. Humanity declares, "Let us make a name for ourselves." This tower was almost certainly an ancient ziggurat, a massive religious and political structure that represented immense human pride, a totally human-centered empire built entirely independent of God. And there's actually a wonderful bit of dry, ancient irony here. Humanity builds this massive, towering structure to reach the heavens, yet the text notes that God still had to come down just to see it. He responds by confusing their languages and scattering them across the earth.
All right, Section 3, Abraham and Divine Covenant, spanning chapters 12 through 22.
Shifting our focus from the universal history of those early chapters, the text zooms in dramatically on patriarchal history, focusing on just one single covenant family. When Abram fears he'll be childless, God promises him descendants as numerous as the stars. And this single sentence in Genesis 15:6, he believed the Lord and he counted it to him as righteousness. This becomes the absolute bedrock for the theological concept of justification by faith. It teaches us that trust in God's promise, not flawless human effort or moral perfection, is the true basis of righteousness. So God initiates this grand plan of redemption through specific covenant promises to Abraham, land, a great name, and crucially, the promise that through him all families of the earth will be blessed. God even confirms this through an ancient, visceral covenant ceremony, appearing as a smoking fire pot that passes between divided animal sacrifices. Now, in the ancient Near East, walking between severed animals was a self-maledictory oath. It was effectively saying, "May this happen to me if I break this promise." It proves God is literally binding himself to the curse if the covenant fails. Later on, circumcision is introduced as the permanent physical sign of this promise. The text gives us a sharp, highly realistic contrast here. On one side, we have human effort, Sarah and her servant Hagar attempting to fulfill God's promise through their own power. This results in the birth of Ishmael and deep, lasting familial conflict, though God mercifully does see Hagar in her distress, revealing himself as El Roi. On the other side, we have divine covenant, God fulfilling his exact promise miraculously through the birth of Isaac in Sarah's old age. This whole narrative culminates in Genesis 22. Now, in the ancient context, child sacrifice was horrifyingly common among surrounding pagan nations, so God asking Abraham to sacrifice Isaac wouldn't have been entirely unusual to an ancient mind. But God stopping it and Jehovah Jireh providing a substitute ram, that was utterly revolutionary, and it heavily anticipates an ultimate future sacrifice. Moving right along to Section 4, Jacob and the 12 Tribes, chapters 23 through 36. We follow the continuation of the covenant through Isaac's son, Jacob. And honestly, the lives of these patriarchs are a fascinating study in profound character flaws. Jacob is a cunning deceiver who actually steals his older brother Esau's birthright and blessing. Yet, in a great stroke of historical irony, Jacob the deceiver is continually deceived by his own uncle, Laban. Still, God works through these deeply flawed people to advance his historical purposes. Jacob's life is ultimately transformed through a literal, desperate nighttime wrestling match with God. Through surrender, he receives a new name, Israel, and goes on to father the sons who will become the 12 tribes of the Israelite nation. Section 5, Joseph and Divine Providence, chapters 37 through 50. This brings us to the final major movement of the book, which focuses heavily on the hidden mechanics of divine providence through Jacob's favored son, Joseph. It's a gripping narrative filled with copious detail and extremely high political tension. We shift from the rural lands of Canaan to the highly sophisticated, massive empire of Egypt. Joseph has these prophetic dreams of exaltation, which causes his brothers to violently hate him. He's stripped of his coat, thrown into a pit, sold into Egyptian slavery, and eventually humiliated as a prisoner based on totally false accusations. Yet, step by step, through divine wisdom, Joseph experiences a staggering rise from a forgotten prisoner to the second-in-command ruler of all Egypt. It shows us that even when God seems completely silent, he remains actively present in the shadows. When a severe famine forces Joseph's brothers to travel to Egypt for food, Joseph tests them, he forgives them, and then he delivers this incredible climactic statement. "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." This is really the ultimate thesis statement that the original ancient author wanted the reader to take away from this entire 50-chapter scroll. Human evil, betrayal, and brokenness absolutely cannot overthrow divine providence. God sovereignly governs human history to bring about redemption. Finally, Section 6, Theological Themes and Christ. Let's look forward. Synthesizing our entire study, we see exactly how every major doctrine originates right here in this ancient text. We see the inherent goodness of creation and the devastating reality of the fall. We see God's binding covenants and his undeniable sovereign providence over human history. Genesis also clearly lays out the doctrine of election, this idea that God repeatedly chooses completely undeserving, flawed people, like Jacob, to carry forward his eternal plan of redemption.
Furthermore, as a history professor looking at the literary continuity of the broader biblical narrative, it is just fascinating to observe the literary typology at play here. This is where ancient historical events act as prophetic shadows of future ones. Genesis is absolutely filled with these types and shadows anticipating a coming Messiah. We see it in the seed of the woman promised in the garden, the ark serving as a vessel of salvation, the mysterious king-priest Melchizedek, Isaac carrying the wood up the mountain for his own sacrifice, and Jacob's vision of a ladder acting as a mediator connecting heaven and earth. Everything is constantly pointing forward.
The book of Genesis begins with perfect harmony in a garden, and it ends with a family dwelling in a coffin in Egypt. It leaves our ancient ancestors as a vulnerable minority in a foreign land, holding on to centuries-old promises. It's a very intentionally unfinished story, and it leaves us pondering a profound question. If human evil cannot overthrow divine providence, how exactly will God fulfill his ancient promise, rescue this family from the looming Egyptian empire, and orchestrate the greatest exodus in human history? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep looking closely at the text.